was hungry for hands. Give me a break.
Carl!
My stomach was making the rumblies
Carl!
that only hands would satisfy.
Acting. Hello, my fellow enthusiasts. Llamas with Hats is an interesting cartoon, filled with interesting characters, even though there are technically only two, gore, horrifying ideas, genocide, and a strange form of character development. The show came out over 10 years ago now, with it basically being one of the first animated shows I have ever seen in terms of indie animation. The premise itself is rather simple. It was created by Jason Steele and is entirely based around these two llamas with hats, with one being a regular Joe while the other one is a dangerous psychopath with a long history of violence. Now, I have to say, almost immediately when I was a kid and I ended up finding this show for myself, I immediately was hooked. Carl and Paul's interactions were absolute gold. Even now, I'm still able to quote what they say word for word. That is how memorable that those moments were. In fact, the entire show is rather memorable because even if you've only seen this show in glancing past, you most definitely at least remember the llamas with hats. Either their voices or that, oh hey, that Carl always ends up doing at the beginning of pretty much every single interaction. However, this show is so much more than just mere gore, as well as simple back and forth banter, even though those are definitely two strengths that this show has. So I've come here today to go ahead and talk about every single good thing about this show and why, in my personal opinion, it is considered a cinematic masterpiece. And also to hopefully convince you that not every show requires game-breaking animation or pretty much anything of that particular nature in order to be considered a great story as well as an interesting show in general. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get right into it. First off, we have the characters, and here's the thing, this show is incredibly simple in the fact that there's only two characters. However, despite both of them being considered main characters, it only really remains that case halfway through the show. Despite him being absolutely crucial for the plot of this show, Paul is more so a side main character, someone who the main focus isn't entirely on, especially later on in the show. In reality, Carl is the main focus of the show, especially later on where he has his entire character arc. So here's the thing, for people who haven't actually seen the show, spoiler warnings moving forward for obvious reasons. The entire show, for lack of a better way to explain it, is quite literally Carl doing worse and worse things over time, mainly in order to get a rise out of Paul. From destroying cruise ships, destroying entire governments, or flat out ripping holes in space-time, Carl has absolutely no limitation on what he is willing to do to get a rise out of Paul. And this is where I feel a lot of people kind of drop the ball in terms of paying attention to these characters, because this small dynamic is incredibly important to Carl's character. Carl is someone with literally endless potential. He is fully capable of doing whatever he desires with very little consequence. And despite this, however, he pretty much does everything in his power specifically to get Paul's recognition. Not in the form of acknowledgement or even positive affirmation, but simply for him to realize what he is doing in that moment. We even see this within the show. Whenever Paul is either completely unimpressed or just flat out uninterested in what he is doing, it actively seems to hurt his feelings as well as his ego, to the point where he is absolutely willing to go through the extra effort to just make his next attempt at craziness even worse than the previous one, just so he can get Paul's reaction. As you would imagine, this is an absolute recipe for trouble, simply due to the fact that Paul reacts to every single thing that Carl does, and as a response, Carl continuously one-ups himself. Eventually, it gets to the point where it's absolute madness, in which Carl continuously does things that would literally destroy entire cities. However, Carl's character becomes far more complex and far more interesting the longer the show goes. The moment that Paul finally decides to leave is the moment we actually get a rather interesting look into the pure insanity that is Carl. However, let me reiterate that this entire partnership was primarily caused due to the fact that Carl kept on getting validated through the reactions of Paul. As right before he leaves, Paul flat out admits that his meat creatures that he later created utilizing the meat and flesh of orphans was actually terrifying, in which he responded with a rather somber thank you. Pretty obvious that Paul is the only person whose opinions actually matter to Carl. This obsession actually gets worse and worse as the show goes on, with him even putting a mask onto a sheep and trying to pretend that it's Paul. And due to the fact that the sheep could not mimic every single thing that Paul typically does, as well as its mannerisms, as well as its speech, it ends up resulting in just enraging Carl to the point where he throws him in the blood canal. He then proceeds to just flat out go into far more dangerous behavior that is ultimately self-destructive, such as burning down his own house down after filling it with swans. To make matters worse, he ended up just pretending that the mask that he created that mimics Paul's face is actually Paul, talking to it and even going out of his way to mimic his voice in order to try to capture the magic of their original interaction, something that he can never truly do. After Paul refuses to come back, it ends up getting so bad that he ends up tying the mask to a tree in order to try to mimic their original interactions between him and Paul, even utilizing people that he killed as props in order to further further make the situation more believable, but even then it is clear that he is failing. He has obviously hit rock bottom. He is homeless, broke, dirty, and overall completely losing his marbles. However, as he hits rock bottom, something ultimately ends up happening that changes the entire course of the story. Paul Mask suddenly comes to life. It is unknown whether or not this is some kind of demon that is possessing the Paul Mask, or if it's just a figment of Carl's imagination, but whatever the case, it ends up doing the worst and best thing that Paul needed at the time. It gave him the reaction that he so desperately craved, as well as the interaction that he also needed. And to make matters both better as well as worse, it even went out of its way to encourage his destructive behavior. Normally this wouldn't work, however, due to the fact that Carl was just so desperate for any kind of validation, he took it the moment the opportunity arose. Basically being played like a fiddle, all while believing that he was the musician. He even goes out of his way to say you came back to the masked Paul, believing that it truly was him. That is how bad he was in terms of his mental state. Now emboldened by the false Paul, as well as given the interaction that he desired, he ended up doing exactly what he originally sought out to do, which was destroying everything in his path. At first, when the original Paul was with him, it was more so just to get a reaction out of him, but the false Paul ends up encouraging him to actually have a plan, taking his unfocused nature and turning it into a pinpoint destructive path into what would ultimately be the end of the world. To quote Carl, all the hands were eaten, all the meat creatures were made, unleashed, and then also eaten, resulting in pretty much nothing left to be done. The original world completely turned into an absolute hellscape as he ended up creating things that typically defy the laws of physics. For example, he created a blood vortex that shocks people and then quickly devours their skin, something that definitely is not exactly something I would consider normal. However, after all of that, after creating all of the meat monsters, after obtaining all the hands, after eating everyone, after destroying the world entirely, Carl finally comes back to his senses, or rather, what remains of them. Just looking at him, it's clear that he's finally on his last leg. After falling within the gore pit earlier and breaking his leg, it's clear that he ended up losing one of them. One of his ears is flat out torn off, and on top of that, his hat is a complete rugged mess. It's a perfect showing that the current Carl that we are seeing right here is significantly different than the one we have been traveling with up to this point. And to really cap it off in terms of this episode, one thing that I really enjoy is his final interaction with the Paul Mask, in which after looking upon the destruction that he himself created, he admits that he is finally done. There's nothing left to complete, it's all gone. And to make matters even more interesting, he is actively angry at both himself as well as the Paul Mask, being so distraught that he doesn't even do the banter that they typically do. Something that, may I remind you, he flat out did even when all of his legs were broken and he was trapped in a gore pit. He was so conflicted that he ends up just straight up yelling at the Paul Mask and even calls him an imposter. With nothing left to do and believing that the Paul Mask was enemy the entire time, he goes out in search of the actual Paul. And what he's met with is the stripped corpse of Paul, with his hat still being on his head, bones picked clean either by rodents or by the monsters that Carl himself produced. And upon seeing it, the first thing that he just decides to say is, "I guess you're gone," with him finally admitting to himself that Paul is never coming back. And after that, it pans to black and then begins to show the destruction that Carl himself ended up causing, with us seeing destroyed buildings, rivers of blood, and even a blood vortex that he actually mentioned earlier in the episode in Paris. And as it shows us this destruction, a slow symphony slowly begins to play in the background as music slowly swells. And slowly but surely, the camera begins to pan to a bridge where Carl is standing at the center, screaming out his own name and replaying the parts that he would always say during his and Paul's interactions. And for the first time within the entire show, we actually see him show genuine sorrow and even tears. And right after this, he finally jumps and ends up taking his own life at the end of the show, marking the end of the series. I have to be honest, I always get a little choked up whenever I see that ending, simply due to the sheer tragedy of it. Because despite Llamas with Hat's weird nature, as well as its obviously gratuitous amounts of gore and insanity, somehow this show manages to make you care about both the characters as well as the world they're in. And overall, the ending, in my opinion, is absolutely genius, as it not only hits you right in the feels, but also is a fitting end to the destructive path of Carl. Overall, I consider both this show as well as the character of Carl to be an absolute masterpiece. But what do you think? Do you think I'm giving him way too much credit? Do you think Llamas with Hats is just a silly show about two llamas with hats and I should stop looking into it so deeply? Let me know below. And thanks again to my patient patrons. I know I do not upload as often as I should, but I am trying my best. But anyway, stay enthusiastic, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Bye.